tents have got to go. That's the message from a community group pushing to get a migrant shelter off of Randall's Island. But as CBS 2 political reporter Marsha Kramer explains, the city says it has no other options.
The Randall's Island.
So this here is one of the most controversial shelters anywhere in New York. Ever since it opened, there have been non-stop reports of violence, including attacks on police, some of which only ended when people went to the emergency room. But even though locals want this shelter shut down, the tents gone, the asylum seekers evicted, the city doesn't have any choice but to keep it open. In fact, they might even be building more of these.
A police presence was visible tonight on Randall's Island. Cell phone video given to us by a migrant shows the chaos. 18 people were arrested.
From the outset, community groups did not like the idea of usurping 8 acres of ball fields and parkland on Randall's Island for a 3,000-bed migrant shelter.
They call this place the death shelter, said Angel. He was placed here at Randall's Island, but says from the moment he walked in, people told him to watch his back.
The city says the facility will house only single adult males. The 84,000 square foot shelter includes cots, there are laundry facilities, a dining hall, and phones that make international calls.
A curfew is set to go into effect at the migrant shelter at Randall's Island, making it the latest shelter in New York City to have a city-imposed curfew.
Now, after months of what one group calls violence, fights, and reports of illegal activity, the Randall's Island Park Alliance says it's time for the city to fold its tents, remove the cots, and hit the road.
Another week, another incident at New York City's infamous shelter on Randall's Island. But what nobody's talking about is that even though a giant tent shelter in a park like this might seem better than having people sleep on the streets, the environment inside these shelters is dangerous, not only for the people who live there, but for the caretakers, the police, and critics say places like this aren't helping anybody. Now, the mayor says these problems come from people not being able to work or have jobs, as they've got no option but to stay at their shelters all day long, which is the case at pretty much every shelter in town, as none of the asylum seekers here are allowed to legally have jobs. But violent incidents at other shelters aren't as common as they are here, because instead of sleeping in comfortable luxury hotel rooms like their counterparts in Manhattan, asylees at the city's various mega shelters sleep in open congregate living situations, an environment where you have rows and rows and rows of beds in massive hangar-like spaces, kind of like an internment camp almost, which has outside observers asking, what are we doing here? How is it humane to create conditions like this, where people reportedly sleep with one eye open because the city is so strapped for cash it can't afford to hire extra police to keep these places safe, which is why things inside this particular shelter can turn chaotic at the drop of a hat. And that brings us to the real reason why we have these massive tent shelters, even though everybody knows they're a terrible idea, and that's because the city's received over 200,000 asylum seekers. And the city's already using 20% of the hotels in town as shelters, revealing the hard truth that we're simply running out of space, yet New York's archaic right to shelter laws mandate anyone on planet Earth gets a free place to stay just for asking. And while critics of the mayor say they want more immigration and more shelters, the city has nowhere else to put people, and as the US border remains in crisis mode with thousands of crossings every single day, the city may be building more tent shelters in the near future, not less. In spite of the reports of gang violence, critics say this type of shelter encourages. So here we are in a park, just like the one where the Randall's Island shelter was built, and they're building something here as well. What that is, I'm not entirely sure, but it's important to understand that the Randall's Island shelter is one of the largest in the city, and that's on purpose. In fact, whereas most of the city's mega shelters hold 1,000 people, Randall's Island holds 3,000 people. But since this shelter's so big it could only be built inside a local park, that's something some local residents aren't too happy about, among other things.
Community groups did not like the idea of usurping 8 acres of ball fields and parkland on Randall's Island for a 3,000-bed migrant shelter. Now, after months of what one group calls violence, fights, and reports of illegal activity, the Randall's Island Park Alliance says it's time for the city to fold its tents.
So here we have local residents that want to see the tents at the Randall's Island shelter gone. And they're upset that their public park space is no longer as usable as it once was before. What's more, it seems another complication has emerged by way of rival rival factions inside this shelter fighting with each other. The New York Post report covers an altercation between groups from South America and Africa. Granted, it only takes a few people in a 3,000-person tent shelter to cause problems, but it seems like this is a problem here more so than it is anywhere else. And you know something? That exposes the inhumanity of policies many New Yorkers say they support. How is this humane, keeping people in a big tent where they can't leave and have to stay all day? Yet this is what right to shelter looks like when the city that's supposed to provide it runs out of space. Yet at this point, 80% of people in New York City say they support right to shelter because it keeps people from living on the street. But at the same time, the people living in the shelters aren't in a position to advance their lives at all. And that's why critics say building facilities like this that cost millions of dollars, they're not cheap, aren't helping anybody.
This was a scene last Thursday at around 11 a.m. According to the NYPD, they responded to a 911 call about a man causing a disturbance at the migrant shelter on Randall's Island.
So if someone showed you that video with no audio, where would you think the video came from? Would you think it came from a multi-million-dollar shelter in a public park in New York or a prison somewhere else? Apparently, the Randall's Island shelter costs $20 million a month to operate. $240 million a year. And you know something? This is very sad for the people who have to live inside that shelter, the vast majority of which came to this country just wanting to start a better life for themselves. But the problem is they have been grossly misled about what that life is going to look like. Because while critics say the city's generous safety net is a magnet for immigration, others say that this is only happening because the truth about what awaits many asylum seekers isn't actually being disclosed to them. Plus, you've got an entire operation of for-profit nonprofits that run the gigantic tents, provide the food, provide some of the security, provide all types of different services for the people who need to live there. They're not too upset with how the shelter's operating. They're making millions. Yet the people that are there didn't realize that they would essentially be trapped there as prisoners because getting jobs and getting on their own 2 feet in America's most expensive city is a lot harder than the people who moved them into this shelter have made it sound. And even though the city's leaders are the ones who set this place up, their hands are tied and they know it because the law says we've got a right to shelter and city officials have to obey it even if this is what it looks like.
Anytime you have 3,000 people who are placed in an environment that they cannot work, they have to sit around all day, things like this have the potential to happen.
Mayor Eric Adams.
Honestly, you can feel the frustration in Mayor Adams' voice. He knows this is a bad situation. Now, is the mayor perfect? No, but he understands 2 important things about the asylum crisis. First, he understands that the desire of activists to house the entire world conflicts with federal requirements regarding work authorization, because the goal of homeless shelters is to help people get on their feet, but that's not something the people in these shelters who are seeking asylum may ever have the opportunity to do, especially if their asylum claim is denied and they're told to leave the country. Not only that, getting official work permission takes months, which is why so many people are hanging out at the shelters with nothing to do. And everyone who understands how this country and its laws work should have realized that this is the situation New York was walking into. Yet from day one, Mayor Adams was vehemently against setting up these HERCs, humanitarian emergency relief centers. That's what they call the big tents. He didn't want to make congregate living facilities in public parks, but he had no choice because he's got to house everyone who comes here looking for a place to stay. Yet these structures aren't even meant to be permanent. They cost more to run than traditional hotels that are shelters in a physical building, which has plumbing and is near infrastructure. And since these are environments that essentially have 3,000 people all sleeping in the exact same room with communal bathrooms and a communal kitchen, no semblance of privacy whatsoever, you've got to wonder how much that negatively affects the mental state of the people in there and keeps them from advancing out of the system to begin with. And the same protesters who say they want these tent shelters to disappear, they're the same protesters who get angry when the mayor finds a building that's in their nice neighborhood by their luxury condo and says, hey, let's make this a humane place to live. Oh no, they don't want that. Which is why these temporary tents might now likely be permanent.
It is to the detriment of all those temporarily housed in the park, along with the thousands of New Yorkers being denied access to parkland, the group said in a letter to Mayor Adams. Moreover, it is illegal and it is time for it to end.
Yeah, this is the same nonsense that happens whenever the city tries to build any shelter anywhere. And this is the exact same thing we're seeing play out in Clinton Hill, Brooklyn, where the city's largest physical shelter stands, housing over 3,000 people in former industrial buildings that used to house corporate offices that have all been shut down. Residents there, 80% of whom probably support right to shelter, have all kinds of complaints about how that shelter's inhumane as well. And even though there are many arguments for how more immigration might be good for New York City, none of those arguments want to account for the reality of the housing shortage the city is facing. On top of that, there are other problems inherent to operating a massive tent shelter in the middle of a soccer field. For one, where do you think all the water goes when it rains? We're in the middle of a field with no plumbing. plumbing, which is why shelters in places like this flood all the time. Plus, we're talking about tents. When it gets really windy, these things can rattle, shake, and become detached. Not to mention, heating them in the wintertime is extremely expensive and cost inefficient. Plus, they're on an island, which is essentially a public park, isolated from the rest of the city, only accessible by a couple of small bridges. And there isn't a subway stop that lands there, so people are walking far in order to do anything. Now, the Randall's Island shelter, it's been open for about 1 year. It was set up as something that was supposed to be temporary, but now residents are starting to learn that it might in fact be permanent, along with the rest of New York City's asylum crisis. And even though they're threatening to sue if the city doesn't pack up the shelter and move people out, the same people inside have nowhere else to go, and that's the problem at every single shelter in this city. So here we have one of the city's better shelters. It's a former hotel here on Orchard Street in the Lower East Side. But just like the people living on Randall's Island, the folks that are here also have nowhere else they can stay. And leaving the shelter system, well, that may never happen, sadly.
Well, after months of urging from both local and state leaders across the nation, President Biden on Thursday expanded temporary protection status for immigrants coming from Venezuela. Mayors and governors from California to New York to Massachusetts had been pushing for the TPS expansion.
So part of the reason that people are still trapped is because 9 months ago, this issue of folks being able to work and get on their feet, well, that was supposed to have been solved, but obviously that's not the case. But one of the main issues we hear facing asylum seekers is that they cannot get normal jobs and live normal lives. And what the federal government did a few months ago was they gave temporary protected status to many people from Venezuela, which has seen hundreds of thousands of its citizens flee and come to the United States to escape violence and poverty. And the reason temporary protected status is so important is because it cuts down on the amount of time people have to wait before getting proper work authorization. And under normal circumstances, folks seeking asylum have to wait 180 days from when they submit their asylum application to when they can get work authorization. But TPS cuts that down to just 1 month. This was supposed to solve the problem of thousands of people sitting around at their shelters not being able to do anything, but it hasn't. Plus, many of the asylum seekers entering the United States from countries in Africa do not benefit from temporary protected status, which means they're still subject to the mandatory 180-day waiting period. But even if they could start working in as little as 30 days, that might not do a whole lot because we still have very high unemployment among those who've recently come to the country, revealing a major problem with how quickly it is for recent immigrants to get integrated into the city's economy, even when work permission isn't in the way. And although every single time the city sets up a shelter, you've got residents complaining that there are just too many people in the neighborhood all of a sudden, no one's able to see that there's some other problem stopping many of these folks from getting jobs. Yet we keep hearing from activists that we've got all of these jobs and we need all of these people to come here and fill them, but those activists may not have passed by their local shelter to see all of the people sitting there without these jobs that they came here believing existed. Part of the problem could be that we're in the middle of a not so great economy. Businesses in many parts of town are reducing their hours and cutting back in order to save money, which unfortunately also means hiring less people. But that's only part of the problem. One of the most popular jobs asylum seekers could get, jobs doing delivery for local businesses and restaurants, those are also now harder to come by, which is the city's fault, as they recently passed minimum wage requirements for delivery riders, and now all of these bikes are sitting around not doing anything, just like the people who ride them, because people are ordering less now that the fees are higher. And at this point, one has to ask themselves, what jobs specifically in New York are available to the people who are in the shelter system? Because if English is not your first language, if instead it's Spanish or French, this clothing store, for example, that has a lot of English-speaking customers may not be able to bring you in if you cannot interact with the people on the sales floor who might want to buy something. And there are only so many jobs in construction and renovation. Will the Postal Service hire you if French is your only language? How about the fire department? How about the police? And what if you're lacking in computer skills? Modern America is an internet-connected country with an economy that's mostly service-based. But even if the answer to those questions was a guaranteed yes, there's another problem facing the asylum seekers, which is that even though New York is a sanctuary city, it's a very expensive one, and you're gonna need a six-figure income if you want to live in one of these little apartments that are around me right now. And part of the problem is restaurants like this across the street just don't have enough six-figure jobs to offer, revealing that work permission by itself is pretty worthless if there aren't any available jobs.
Close to 500,000 Venezuelans living in the U.S. before July 31st have been granted temporary protected status. The status status, allowing Venezuelan migrants and asylum seekers to live and work legally in the country for 18 months.
Again, this was 9 months ago, and today we still have a crisis of people being in shelters who cannot leave, cannot get jobs, have nothing to do. And although many people would like to place the blame for these problems squarely upon the people with whom it affects, critics say the city isn't doing enough to accurately inform asylum seekers of the reality that awaits them if they come here and if they check into a hotel. Instead, as soon as people arrive in the city, a red carpet of caseworkers are essentially rolled out for them. And immediately at the Roosevelt Hotel Welcome Center, they can meet with people that help them do all of their necessary paperwork, asylum applications, medical checkups. But if people came here with the intent to get employed, how come we're not telling them that those jobs might not actually be out there? And even though it looks like the city has unlimited resources when it comes to housing and feeding people, where are the resources for teaching people how to make a living on their own? Where are the resources teaching people valuable trades like welding or masonry work? Where are the college classes teaching people how to become part of our advanced economy? That might sound facetious, but it exposes the massive disconnect between all of the people who say we need more immigration, not less. Yet every time a shelter gets set up, they want it shut down. And every time people are sitting around being unable to work, they get upset, they protest. But at no point does anyone consider that the reason folks aren't getting jobs is because the economy is over here and maybe their skill set isn't aligned with it just yet. Observers say this means you can't be an advocate for the city's current immigration policies if you don't also believe that the city has thousands of unfilled jobs that everyone can immediately sign up for. And this does a great job explaining why activists are so upset right now. They see all of these people sitting around and they see the unused potential of so many folks who want to work and can't. But at the exact same time, they don't understand that every single restaurant and every single boutique isn't hiring or doesn't have positions that these folks can immediately fill. They also don't seem to understand that our advanced service sector, jobs like finance, jobs like accounting, many of which would require a college degree, might be off limits to people that don't have a degree and haven't yet achieved language proficiency in English. Is that what's happening? Does New York City's asylum crisis exist partly because the people advocating for it don't understand the dynamics facing each and every one of those asylum seekers? And should the city do more to prepare people for life outside of a shelter, for life on their own 2 feet economically? Or is that impossible because the asylum crisis as is already so expensive that the city's now resorted to building tent shelters for people because they can't live in rich neighborhoods for some reason? Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video.